Hello. My name is Michelle. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Midwest Regional Director on the Democracy, Politics, and Elections team here at Act Blue. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and welcome you to our panel discussing what 2020's digital fundraising innovation means for the future. So I'd like to start by thanking all of our panelists for joining us and invite them to introduce themselves as well as talk about their work. And we'd like to start with a question asking, um, when did you realize that last year was going to be a little different and not just a quick shutdown? And for all of our guests joining us today, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I will actually start with Danny.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michelle. My name is Danny Sigwalt, and I am Executive Director of PowerShift Network, and I'm calling from Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral homelands of the Piscataway people. And PowerShift Network works to mobilize the collective power of young people to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So in practice, what that means is we provide a lot of trainings and resource development supports for young organizers who are leading or working in organizations to do projects that vary from mutual aid support to direct campaigning around local and national legislation to local resiliency organizing and education work around climate to make sure that folks have access and are building relationships and networks to build power collectively. And I knew that Ms. Rona was going to be a pretty big deal, probably at the onset, because I knew that the federal administration wasn't doing what it needed to be doing to make sure that folks are going to be kept safe. And am always kind of ready doing climate work for paradigm shifts and to make things work regardless of what's happening. That being said, it was probably early May by the time that I realized that, schools weren't going to be opening the next year in the ways that we were hoping, and that we really needed to lean in and change our approach to the work that we were doing.
Thank you. Jamara, I will have you go next.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for having me here on this panel. Looking forward to the conversation. But to everyone watching, my name is Jamar Brown. I serve as the co-executive director of the Texas Democratic Party. Proud, I've been in this role about 3 months now, so I'm still learning a lot in terms of this role, but I'm very excited to be doing this very important work. But I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Austin, Texas. And for me, I think one of the things, as Danny mentioned, for example, that we knew from the onset that this was going on due to the leadership, not just of the federal administration, but some states, and I'm naming Texas where I live, where people did not particularly take the pandemic very seriously, especially those who made critical executive decisions. But I think that there's a step that we have to take that went even before the shutdowns happened across the country in March. I think we have to know that there were folks who were getting sick in fall of 2019. And many of us were still organizing and traveling the country. And it built and built and built. And so I think that that's one of the things that's important about the leadership that we have in this country and across in many states. And so, as Danny mentioned, we've had to change. At the time, I served as the director of civic engagement programs at Repower, which was formerly Wellstone Action, which was a national training and progressive training and capacity building organization. And so, at that time, we had to particularly take where we trained candidates and campaign practitioners, data folks, digital folks. We really had to heighten a lot of our digital awareness for people to be able to contact voters because we are in the middle of an election. So how do we still talk to people about the elections that are happening? Many elections across the country got pushed back, especially primaries, local elections that happened in the spring and the summertime. And so there was a real impact not only on the day-to-day of organizations, but even just our democracy and how we function in elections really changed, how we had to talk to people, how we showed up in elections. And so I think that across the country, we're still seeing a lot of that now to where we have to show up in our democracy in different ways. And COVID has forced us to really heighten not just digital fundraising, but also digital engagement. And so I know we'll talk a lot about that, and I'm happy to join that conversation and that we're still navigating COVID unfortunately, in a lot of realistic ways.
Thank you. Shannon.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And good to hear from everybody about how we all were handling last year. And I would say, sorry to introduce myself. I'm Shannon Worthman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently the Senior Director of Digital Strategy at Civic Nation, which is nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that includes organizations such as When We All Vote, It's On Us, United States of Women, Made to Save, and a bunch of others. Last year specifically, I was leading digital strategy for When We All Vote, and very similar to what Jamar said, we didn't really have time to think how long is this going to be lasting. We really needed to shift pretty quickly because, to his point, primary dates were changing, and vote by mail, everyone was talking about vote by mail, and there was so much misinformation out there. So we really, within a few weeks, I think, really started to see in-person events were completely getting canceled. Obviously, in-person voter registration, it was a huge, basically the majority of our program that we had planned last year. So we really had to switch all of that to online. We started doing virtual couch parties where we were, trying to bring some exciting talent, having a cool playlist to listen to while we all were texting voters. And so I think we just really refocused our digital efforts on reaching voters directly to get them the information that they needed, and then also just reaching voters more broadly online to educate them about what was going on. So much was changing. It was so confusing. But that was really our big push. And to Jamar's point, also, we're continuing that into this year. Again, there's still a lot of misinformation. COVID's not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. So we're just continuing that work to educate people online where they are.
Lovely. Thank you all. I think to follow up from that, the next question I have for all of you is looking forward to now. How has digital organizing and grassroots small dollar donor engagement continued to form as a part of your organizing strategy at your organizations? And would you say that the work from the last 18 months has felt like a continuation of things that were leading into 2020? Or does some of it seem new and innovative and different than what had been expected last cycle? And I'll start with Jamar for this question.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I mean, I feel like personally for me, it's, it's been a continuation of, especially, obviously, we're very focused on candidates and elections here at the Texas Democratic Party, but one of the things I think that's fundamentally important is, over the course of the past few election cycles, we've been having real conversations about how do we raise money online and how do we engage people online in a way that means that they're taking action. And so what we've had to learn over the past few months is really there's two pieces that's connected. So well before I became executive director of the party, my background is in organizing. And so I think of this as, almost like a ladder of engagement. So my organizers out there will know, right? And so for us, it's about, how are we making sure that we're asking people to take action and that donating to various causes, but also now we're trying to add like relational organizing as another ask. And so making sure that the ask isn't just about money, but the ask is also about people seeing themselves in the process. And part of them contributing to our organizations is they're investing in the work that's happening. So for us, there are lots of folks that, give to us, if it's $5, $10, $25, $50, they also are helping us register voters. They're also helping us testify at the Capitol and do certain things. And so I think that what we've been able to see is that additional action that we've been asking people to be able to take to get folks to sign petitions. Now what we've been doing is looking into ways to add what we call our relational organizing model, right? How are we now, as if I'm contributing to something, how am I going into my network and asking other folks to be able to do some of those particular pieces? And so for us, it's also because COVID presented a lot of economic challenges for people. I think probably all of our organizations saw a hit in our fundraising, right? Because, we had to make the shifts, but we also had to message in a way that when people are dealing with a pandemic, when they were still, parents were having to be teachers and soccer coaches and parents all at the same time in the middle of the day, how do you make these political issues a priority for people to contribute to when folks were trying to figure out if they could pay their rent, if they can keep their lights on, if they could feed their families? And so now that I think we've been able to advance and been able to move, we've been able to see that happen. The last piece that I'll share is, part of some of our digital fundraising work that we've been able to do is that we're trying to cultivate people's continued investment. So whereas folks before may have given $5, $10, $25, we're asking people to make those recurring. We're also asking people to even increase as part of that, because that helps us fund our voter registration work, our mobilization work, our engagement work, et cetera. And so people are also seeing as part of our messaging some of the critical work that we're doing. But, I will be remiss if I did not say that obviously in Texas, we are, facing, lots of major policy and issue challenges. And so this has allowed us to be able to keep our doors open, increase our resources, in which we've been able to fight back against some of the most heinous legislation for our fourth legislative session this year. And so we've seen that increase activity, with us and, with our donors. And we've seen new donors come in because we've also been trying to extend the network as well and make it easy, but also make it something reasonable within the middle of many asks and many things that are still going on with COVID and other situations.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely feel as though last year was one of those years where everyone was just trying to figure out like how can we do something different. And so many of the things that we came up with were like little things that were existing before, and we're like, we're just going to try this at mass scale and see what sticks. Shannon, I'd love to hear your answer here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Jamar, you're totally spot on around a lot of about everything that you said, really, that I think for us, the different groups of like activists and grassroots donors are really one and the same often. So we were really using what are grassroots donors reacting to and using that as a barometer for, activism and kind of vice versa. I would also say one big thing that, Michelle, your point of like, let's focus in on a couple of things that we work and kind of try to really press on those instead of trying to do too much, especially with everything that's going on, is really focusing on trying to show the power of someone's donation. So if you are able to invest with us, whether it's $1, $5, $100, we want you to know what we're going to do with the money, and then we want you to we want to show that impact on the other side. So is it voter registration? We're going to be able to do more voter registration outreach, more voter education, or even, of course, this year with so much advocacy around, really everything around voting, around women's gender equity issues, so much. So really just, I think, trying to really hone in on the message of here's what we're going to do with your money, and then showing the donors and the activists that maybe aren't able to donate at this time, but they want to help in other ways, kind of showing them the power of them being involved.
Thank you. And Danny.
Thanks, Michelle. And Jamar and Shannon, there's a lot that resonates with a lot, like almost everything that you've been saying with regards to thinking about your donors as parts of your base and cultivating recurring donors from your one-time small dollar donations that really resonate with me. One of the things that's been most interesting for me as a climate organization is there's always this spirit of disaster response when we're doing climate work and trying to figure out how to navigate understanding that people are in crisis, right? And people are either having a really hard time paying their own bills or have, with just reason, a lot of cause to want to redirect their money elsewhere where they're seeing more bleeding, essentially more suffering around, we were in a moment where doctors didn't have PPE, and still in many places that's the case. A lot of our donors care a lot about climate, but also understand climate as a deeply intersectional issue, and that we need to be focusing folks who are most marginalized and most suffering at any given moment in our movement work, which really, really has made things difficult in terms of figuring out how to articulate the ask and understand the value of working towards climate justice, and also articulating that our work and our COVID response work is actually climate justice work, in terms of the fact that a lot of our young folks suddenly, like very suddenly, were kicked off campus and no longer had housing. And the young folks who were coming from marginalized backgrounds didn't necessarily have homes that they could go home to. And that kind of like urgency and emergency was something that we were organizing around and supporting our member organizations to show up for, and that kind of community response and mutual aid is actually foundational to climate organizing work, and that they were actually supporting folks who are dealing with the impacts of COVID while also strengthening infrastructure for climate resiliency organizing, and that it was all part of the same conversation in some ways. That being said, there's also a desperation and an anxiety about the state of the world and burnout, like emotional burnout, that climate activists are very, very familiar with, that it feels like a lot of the rest of the world has been feeling around COVID. And so we've really been thinking about, bringing people into our organization with that kind of spirit of, okay, if we're doing something about this, you're going to feel less helpless. Showing up and being a part of a solution is really an important part of fighting burnout around all of these social justice issues, and that we're providing a community and asking people to show up in the ways that they can. So for some people that's money, but in other cases it's about sharing resources or facilitating connections, mentorship, whatever that is, inviting people to come to the table as a response to the current political moment to help themselves, but also help the larger landscape, has been a big part of our messaging.
Thank you. That what all of you said definitely resonates. So I want to get into some specific questions, actually starting with Shannon. I think last year we saw a massive increase on digital campaigns around voter registration, around early vote from home. And now we're seeing efforts across the country to roll a lot of that back, whether it's when, where, how, or even who is voting. So how do we use digital organizing to get through to voters when there's so much voter information online and it's constantly changing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a constant battle that I think so many of us that do this work are fighting against. Of course, last year there was so much that was new. Voting is so different depending on where you live across the country. Of course, I don't know if this was a good thing, but it was a presidential year. There were a lot of people paying attention. It was on the news every day. So I don't think that most people knew there were elections, but it was hard to get people to understand what all of their options were. Of course, most people hadn't voted by mail before. Some people might not be aware that they had early voting options. So we really did a lot to just try to break things down by state, even sometimes by, local community and municipality, to help people understand what their options were and are now. That work obviously continues. Every year is an election year. We have some really big ones coming up this year across the country. And I think one of the biggest things that we learned was, of course, we're always going to try to put out messages really broadly through social media or email programs, but using trusted messengers was really probably I would say the most impactful way that we communicated with voters last year. And it really looked different depending on who we were trying to talk to. Some younger, Gen Z audiences might resonate more to see an influencer that they really connect with talking about voting. In a lot of places, that's going to look like relational organizing, talking person to person with people in your community, or having partnerships with community organizations that really have a broad reach and are really trusted in their communities. So, there were a lot of different ways. I think that work really, really continues, but it really comes down to breaking down the information to people and just letting them know, here are the exact steps you need to get registered and get ready and out to vote.
Thank you. I am going to switch over to Jamar and give you both an opportunity to respond to what Shannon just said. Obviously, Texas has had a lot of these laws put in place in the past couple months. And then also ask, as someone who's both worked at Repower and is now heading to Texas Dems, what are some important points that you'd highlight for candidates and for organizations looking to increase their digital organizing and increase their small dollar donor presence?
Yeah, well, one of the things I think that's fundamentally important, yes, Texas has been a huge battleground when it comes to those issues. We have been in legislative session at various points since January. We're actually still in session, figuring out redistricting in maps and those sorts of things. And unfortunately, the trans youth ban passed committee. Unfortunately, a few days ago. And so we're still constantly moving. And I think Danny was alluding earlier to this piece about like having to continue to respond at the political moment and understanding that. And understanding what that conflict is between asking people to be recurring, sustained donors and also, in addition, responding to the moment and ensuring that the resources that these organizations have are consistently there. Because that's a huge part of the other side's work, is to make us tired, to drown out our bank accounts, and all those other things. And so that is something that we constantly see and experience here at the party, but are seeing amongst candidates. One of the things I think that, two things I'll name. One thing is many states are still doing redistricting. It's actually putting a lot of candidates behind, especially if you're redistricting a city council, if you're redistricting county commission or county council, but also especially as you go up to the state legislature and even the congressional level. And one of the things I think that's important for candidates to start doing now is to understand what this moment is. But understand what this moment is and how it impacts people in your particular districts as well, and in your particular communities. That's an important piece. And I think that this is a question not just about digital infrastructure, but I do think that this is a question about messaging. And how are you talking to people on our side of the table who are beat down because we've been at this for 10 months now? And that's a real question that we're trying to answer, because the answer just can't be that we're saving democracy. The answer's got to be that people see themselves in the process and see you as a leader in your respective community that's going to change that, to be able to build that. I think the other piece too, in terms of digital awareness is, making sure that you are on various platforms and making sure that you are building either staff or volunteer capacity that can help you do that. One of the things that I've been sharing with candidates as they come to the party is have to make sure that you have consistent contact and consistent content and things for people to do. The other piece that we're challenging ourselves to do is, and we talked about this earlier, is also moving people to action, right? Because you have to be careful not to fall into this pit hole of always being the one asking for money. We could get that as a party. You could get that as candidates, right? That every email you send is just about money. You've also got to do some work to also make sure that you're taking people to action, that you understand the issues that are going on in the community or in that district, that you understand the plight of voters and people in those communities, but that people actually take action. So sometimes in our emails, we're sending, sign this petition. And then after you sign this petition, for example, then we ask you to donate. And so sometimes in some of these heightened urgent moments, yes, we need to ask for money, but we also need to meet people where they are in those particular moments as well. And so for us, that's what we've been trying to balance, not only as a party, but what we've been sharing with candidates and other political organizations in Texas is, what's the thing that's going to move people to action? Because sometimes we think that the only action that people can take is donating money. And sometimes we have to figure out how to make it an and. I'm investing in the movement and in the cause, and I am also engaging my fellow voter, my neighbors, my friends, my family, et cetera, and people of like-mindedness. And so I think that those are the places where we've got to get, especially for those, either of you are listening here, but those that you may interact with, especially when you're running on the local and even state legislative, state rep, state senate level. You've got to understand the plight of your community. And in a lot of cases, community members are also struggling because of some of these issues, right? And so they're trying to figure things out for their own bank accounts and their own checking accounts. And so I think that you just have to have that conscientiousness to understand where your people are in your particular district to be able to move them to action.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect segue to my question for Danny. So I want to give you a chance to respond to everything that's been said, but want to specifically ask, We're looking at Bulbancha, which is a Chicagoan name for New Orleans, the original name for New Orleans. Or if we're talking about the Gullah people of South Carolina or the indigenous tribes across the country fighting to preserve their land, or the wildfires across the West Coast that are tearing through neighborhoods, we're constantly seeing this intersection of climate justice and climate change and racial justice. But when we're looking at the average age of donors or the average age of voters, we're seeing some of that skew a little bit older. So, how do we encourage our activists to be both activists in action and activists in donating? And what have you found to be the most successful grassroots fundraising efforts by the young people that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some degree, I want to push back against the idea that young folks aren't donating at the same rate as older people are, because there's a lot that flies under the radar. There's such a culture of mutual aid support that's happening right now. I literally can't open my social media without seeing requests for support for trans folks, parents, whatever, folks across the country who may or may not be dealing with the ramifications of a climate disaster or COVID or, extractive capitalism under white supremacy. There's a much bigger sense of collective responsibility around making contributions to individuals that exists right now that just isn't data that's being collected. And there's a lot of shifts in terms of the ways that young folks are able and eager to share that data. It's also really interesting because that makes it a lot more difficult to be building relationships, especially digitally, with these folks, because there isn't the same opportunity to collect data and make the calls to say thank you or send a follow-up email even. So from an organizational standpoint, I think it's really important to differentiate between like larger movement support and philanthropy that Gen Zers and other young folks are participating in, and the kind of more institutional 501c3 political campaign donations that are happening. Young folks are showing up and they are distributing money across the board. It's just happening in ways that aren't as tied to institutional pillars that exist. And working with young organizers, it's really interesting because our organizations range the gamut from, a small group of high schoolers in like Seattle to Sunrise Movement. So there's a whole spectrum of needs and fundraising strategies that exist there. And really the fundraising side from organizations or with organizations, the question is about how we hold on to people to be able to grow those income streams has been huge. And I think that there's a lot of real opportunity there for folks like ActBlue to figure out how to capture those kind of super, super easy, quick donation models, but then make sure that we're able to access and build relationships with the folks who are giving money, even if it is just like $5 at a time, because those are the folks who we need to be building relationships with, because hopefully one day they will have more discretionary income. And then I think another thing that I want to offer is that young folks are much more cynical, I think, than they've been in previous generations. I know as a millennial that there's definitely a lot of mistrust of government systems and a lot of energy that goes towards building alternatives and making sure that we're taking care of our own communities and not being as dependent on government systems to make sure, especially around climate stuff, that our needs are going to be met around climate resilience and making sure that our communities are safe and taken care of, especially in the face of disasters. There are, all of the rapid response groups that exist across the country kind of model that. Right now we have member organizations like Bulbancha Collective and Rogue Climate that have shifted to doing almost entirely mutual aid support because the landscape is just so dire around climate, that a lot of young folks are really realizing that they need to be investing in like the collective well-being and a better future as much as they need to be investing in their individual futures, right? Like I know a lot of folks in their early 20s who like have probably donated $1,000 in the past year through mutual aid, but don't have any kind of retirement accounts because they think that the collective well-being is more important, and that we need to really be facilitating a culture shift towards system change, because system change is a better investment for them than a retirement account.
Thank you. I, as a millennial, definitely also feel that way.
I do too.
Yeah. And also, Mike, I too don't have a retirement account. But I actually want to go back to something you said earlier and pose this question to all of you. You'd mentioned earlier, Danny, so many college students last year who ended up having to go home. And I think a lot of the stories we were reading is that they're going home to places that don't have great broadband access, but are still expected to turn in their homework, to write their papers. We had elementary and middle and high school students in the same situation. So we're seeing technology continue to be the connection and the driver of so much that we do, but we're also seeing that broadband access is an issue both in urban and in rural areas. So how do we work to bridge that gap with digital organizing and funding in areas where the digital is limited? So Danny, I'll actually have you start.
Oh my gosh, that's a really great question. I think that there's a lot. I mean, I think that there's like just massive systems level issues that, we can talk about band-aids, but really like internet access needs to be a public utility, and it needs to be seen as a right for everybody in this country, because, every part of life in some ways is dependent. Like people are grocery shopping online, like so many aspects of our life are dependent on access to the internet, that it's unreasonable for this divide to be continuing to like grow in so many ways across the country. That being said, I think that there's a lot of responsibility for local governance to make sure that internet companies are providing resources to folks who are low income, but also just like investing in the infrastructure. A lot of these places don't have the literal infrastructure, which goes back to so many of these foundational issues that we're dealing with in this country, with lack of investment, and honestly, just like a lack of interest in investing in the future. That goes back to like young folks realizing that we need to be investing in system change rather than individual need or greed or whatever you want to think about it as.
Thank you. Let's see, alphabetical. Jamar, I will have you go next. Feel free to respond to Danny as well.
Sure. And just add to that, because I absolutely agree with Danny. Access to the internet should be a right. You do almost anything in life. Our walks of life all somehow merge on the internet. And I think that one of the things that I'll offer as part of the conversation, this is where corporate and system accountability campaigns come in. And I think there are two layers that we have to look at when we do this, right? There's the corporations, the internet companies, et cetera, that are, not expanding, especially into rural areas and areas with high levels of people of color. I think there's that one access. But I do think there's some government regulation and some systemic pieces that exist, right? And so this goes back, and I don't want to be the one that always harps that says elections have consequences, but who are we electing? In some parts of the country, public works and public utility boards are elected. And so, those are people who can be working every single day to help advance and to expand access. If you're not elected, in Texas, in some counties they are elected, but a lot of places they may be appointed. There's somebody that is, if it's a mayor, if it's a city council, if it's a state legislature. I know, for example, our neighbors in Louisiana, they elect a public works commissioner statewide. And so there are people who are elected and appointed by people who are elected. And so this is why our advocacy campaigns, but also our corporate campaigns, and they have to come together. And we have to, put pressure on both ends and do that continued advocacy work in the broader sense. And so this is also a way for us to make sure that we're engaging people. Because another challenge that we face as part of the COVID-19 is, how are we educating our children, right? That if everyone can't hop on Zoom to listen to the teacher's lesson, we're still experiencing that now in Texas. And I'm sure that is still happening even across the country. And so that was the biggest shift. If you want to, for working moms, working dads, working families that they experience, and that a lot of us had to work from home. We're not doing Netroots, right? That we have technology. How many people may not be able to even access some of this? Not knocking Netroots now, but just thinking about people in rural areas who could really benefit from a lot of these conversations, but also know that there are resources available for them to tap into. And so those are all things that we have to think about. And so we have to continue our advocacy and start moving also our advocacy, not just to broader issues that, we care about and principles that we care about, but this is an opportunity to say we have some fundamental needs as people in this country. How do we take our organizing skills, our fundraising skills, and what tools we have to engage people, because this issue impacts everyone, and to be able to move the needle so that when organizations want to reach beyond urban areas, and that's a question I get all the time at the party, right? How do you go beyond Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio? How do you go to other parts of the state? And that's always been the challenge, especially, in terms of some of the technology. And so I think that those are some pieces, and there are people in place that are responsible to help move that. And if they're not moving on that, that's our basic organizer stance, is to help build a coalition and let's get people moving on these critical issues, because this helps movements, this helps organizations, small businesses, schools. So many people are impacted by this.
Thank you. Yes, Shannon.
Yeah, I mean, you both are spot on. Obviously, there are huge systemic issues that, us as individuals can't necessarily take on entirely. I love that you said elections have consequences. Of course, they do, positive and negative, regardless. I think the only thing that I will add is that, I think as a national organization, I think it's really important to not take the tactic of, almost like a savior, and I'm going to come into these communities and I'm going to tell them how to fix their problems. I think it's really, let's go talk to the people in the communities and see how we can be supporting them in the best way. And that might be just help us raise some money, that it might be help us recruit more volunteers. It might just be help us get out the word that this is such a huge problem. And of course, we have seen it's still happening today that people, to your point, Jamar, there are probably people that couldn't get on this conversation today because of lack of internet access, or even just bad internet access, which is obviously a huge problem too. So I think that's just really the biggest thing I wanted to add, is it's important to support people on the ground in the way that they actually really need it, instead of how we would think that they would need it coming from a national perspective, because every community is incredibly different across the country, and there's really no way to anticipate that until you're there.
Thank you. I actually want to follow up on something that Chara mentioned with our communities, with so many communities wanting more support and more help. But we also have on the other end so many of our communities, especially communities of color, that feel like the only time that we're knocking on doors, that we're calling, that we're sending ads or asking for these donations is when it's election time. So how do your organizations, how do you encourage other organizations to stay engaged with voters and donors in between cycles? And what do you think some of the biggest barriers are to keeping folks engaged when there's an election all the time? So Jamar, I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's also something, we've been working on, here, specifically at the Texas Democratic Party. So one of the things I think that's, fundamentally important is, yes, there are a lot of rapid response moments, right? There are a lot of political moments that we all, I'm sure, have had to meet in different circumstances. But one of the things I think that we have to be mindful of is that we can't only ask people to donate when something's going on, or when we need them to do something, or like you were saying, Michelle, right, that we only come to you when it's time for a vote, right? Especially in communities of color, and especially with young people. And so one of the things that we've been doing, particularly in Texas, is working to make sure that we are building a strategy that's multi-cycle, one, and thinking of how are we engaging and how are we galvanizing people early. Number two, we are part of an initiative called Democrats Care. And this allows us to work with our county parties and Democratic clubs across the state to be able to show up in communities. So for example, when the power grid went out in February, that made national news, that millions of us, and myself included, were sitting out of power Democratic clubs, people who did have power and access, or when our power came back on, we did what we call wellness checks, for example, that we were able to call people and ask how they're doing and be able to direct them to resources, if that's food, if that's rental assistance, other particular needs, right? That we showed up in February, March of this year and didn't wait until there's an election. How are we registering voters now? How are we working, for example, in high schools, that we're registering 17-year-olds that will be 18 by the next election, whether that be the primary or the general election, and being able to do some of those things. And so, we've been attending community events and festivals where safe, obviously, I'm in the midst of that. And so we have been very cognizant. And we actually at Texas Democratic Party were able to keep almost a full-size staff, because also the other piece of showing up is, especially in organizations and in campaigns, a lot of it's capacity, right? Because we see a ramp up in capacity and in staffing during elections, and then they ramp down probably pretty significantly. And so here at Texas, we fortunately were able to raise the money to keep our staff so that we could have that year-round engagement. And so for us in Texas, we have the benefit normally in normal cases where we have an election and then legislative session and then an election. We don't have a legislative session every year. So it allows us to find pivotal points to keep people engaged on issues. We're actually doing two things. We're doing a listening tour. I actually was in Laredo, Texas, which is near the border. And we just met with community groups while we were there. We met with media to get our message out there. And meeting with people a year and some change before an election makes a significant difference, not me showing up next September or October. And so I think that as organization leaders, department leaders, organizers, fundraisers, et cetera, we've got to be mindful to think of how do we build the capacity in our organizations to be able to have those engagement tactics. And so that's been a huge piece for us. But, showing up with people and showing up for people earlier in the process has definitely been helpful. We have been able to turn people out to the Capitol. We've shown up at city halls, but we've shown up at community centers. We've shown up at community festivals. We've shown up, we do a farmer's market here in Austin, for example, and Democrats register people at the farmer's market, right? And so while you're getting your produce for the week, you're able to have some conversations with folks and just meet people where they are and be in their communities so that people see you, but people also know you and people feel that they're connected to you. And so when candidates and party leaders and other folks are saying, hey, time to go vote, there's a reason that they're going to vote because they've been engaged in their communities, in their spaces, and on issues that they care about.
Thank you. Shannon, I'd love to hear your response to that. And also would add, I think around civic engagement, a lot of us think of that election time. We think of like the voter registration deadline, the deadline to early vote, the deadline to mail back your ballot. So how do you work to get folks engaged, not specifically around those deadlines, but just better civic knowledge in general in between elections?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, obviously, in an off year, although of course there's so many elections happening, but it is really hard to get people to pay attention. I think going back to something Danny had said before, there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of apathy that of course people that are on the ground doing the work are really feeling that, but just I think the average person is tired. There's so much happening and it can be really hard to stay engaged. So I think again it really goes back to tying, again, something that Jamar said, tying elections have consequences, tying things that are happening all year round to reasons to stay civically engaged. So obviously we've seen many examples of that this year, but when again, just kind of coming in at the end, people get burnt out by those messages of just like, come and vote. We need you to vote. We need you to register now. I think that it's really building that longer tail of understanding why is your vote important? Of course we hear, all the time, my vote doesn't matter. And we know that that's not true, being people that do this work all the time. So I do think that really showing people, that, for example, Jamar, I'm sure that you experienced this a lot. There was a super huge snowstorm in Texas that caused a lot of really bad stuff to happen. We can tie that directly to voting, and why you should continue to be engaged. Really, I mean, the majority of issues that I could think of can in some way be tied back to voting. So I think it's educating people around what does your vote impact? Even the whole way up to the Supreme Court, for example. Obviously, we as people do not vote for who goes on the Supreme Court, but we vote for the people that put them there. So, there's just a lot of things that I think we can continue to have people understand all of the tons and tons and tons of ways that their vote has an impact on really everything that happens in our lives. So I think that's one of the ways to kind of break through some of that burnout. And I think it's really important to, when talking to voters or talking to volunteers, to have empathy for what everyone is going through. We aren't robots as people that work in organizations like ours, and people, regular voters aren't robots either. So I do think it is important to kind of show that more personal, empathetic side too, whenever we're trying to kind of get people to come into the work with us.
Thank you. And Danny, I want to turn it over to you, and also follow up and ask, we're talking about burnout, and I think a lot of when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about racial justice, it's videos, it's snowstorms, it's wildfires. So it's kind of this like double impact of seeing it on social media, seeing it in these digital spaces, and living it. So it's in some sense like easier to stay active in between elections, but it also leads to that burnout. So what are some of the ways that your team tackles that?
For sure, thanks. I think it's really interesting to hear folks who are so rooted in electoral work talk about these things. We're a network. We have more than 100 member organizations now, and we definitely have organizations that spend, the majority of their energy thinking about election and legislative work. But our staff team, that's not necessarily the case. We're really pushing forward a deep political analysis to help folks understand the connections between these issues, and think creatively about the solutions that exist. And a lot of those solutions definitely have to do with government. And I in no way want to minimize that because it's huge. And also, I think that there's like a level of understanding the root causes related to the social issues, the climate crisis, social inequality, everything that's existing right now that's so horrific, that goes beyond the individuals who are being elected and the overall system that goes into corporate influence, right? But also the fact that this country specifically was founded on genocide and kidnapping, right? So that we need to be thinking about systems levels approaches that are going to actually transcend generations, not just election cycles, to be building towards something better, and that those solutions, we have access to those solutions and we're working towards them together, but also understanding that building the political education to help folks who are, oriented and situated in climate work to understand how climate work, for example, is related to the abortion ban in Texas right now, and have those conversations, and understanding that reproductive justice is a climate justice issue, and that there are folks who are talking about overpopulation as a root cause of the climate crisis, which is also rooted in like those arguments are like essentially eugenicist and racist, and that everything is incredibly connected, and that our best chance at showing up to disrupt oppressive systems has to do with our own individual political education and pushing that and sharing that and learning together in order to be coming to these solutions together that are going to take generations, right? Like it's going to take generations to challenge these things, but those are our organizational focuses. And it means that we are thinking about climate change and climate disasters as kind of peak moments in terms of our own mobilization of people, but that we're just as interested in thinking about housing justice and how we're mobilizing climate activists to show up in solidarity in those moments and have grounded political analysis that allows them to be useful, and also build power for climate justice in the process.
Thank you. I actually am going to switch gears a little bit. We talked about activists, we talked about donors, we talked about voters. And I think the one group that we've talked around but haven't named are volunteers, who are activists, who are donors, who are voters, and fuel a lot of the work that we do. And also had to make a lot of adjustments last year like so many of my volunteers were like, I hated using the dialer, and now you're telling me I have to use it for the rest of the cycle. Like, I don't know how to send, like, what's this relational organizing tool? Like, how am I supposed to use this? So I would love to talk about our volunteers and what they did differently last year, how we worked with them to make sure they stayed engaged and stayed involved and stayed passionate and also didn't experience burnout. So Danny, I'm actually gonna come right back to you.
Yeah, I think that is a really great question. And I'm thinking about, how I could represent our member organizations in answering it. But I think internally, we definitely have folks from our network who show up for like our organizational network structures and work. And it all has to do with relationships, right? And like deep care for people. I recently was listening to a podcast about burnout, and one of the things that was really important in terms of like being able to move past burnout and not move past burnout, avoid burnout. That's the goal. Is a bubble of love, and that's what Power Shift Network aims to be for our young folks. Honestly, like a bubble of love and support that makes folks want to come back, and a space where we really care genuinely about people's well-being. That's hard to do when you have thousands and thousands of volunteers. That's not where we're at. That's not our organizational model, but we really like work hard to make sure that our folks have what they need. If they need a job, or if they need whatever, we're like able and equipped to connect people with resources that they need on a human level, but also an organizational level to thrive as much as possible.
Thank you. I will go to Shannon next.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll just give a couple of just quick examples of some creative ways that our volunteers got engaged last year with When We All Vote. I'm always in awe of them. They're so creative. They come up with really cool things. They're volunteers. They're doing this in their own time because they really care. We had one program that we worked on as an organizing staff and as a staff largely, called Fuel the Vote, that was basically holding outdoor COVID-safe, socially distanced food drives. That, of course, a lot of volunteers came and supported that. And then they actually took that model and started doing it themselves. So, doing voter registration at these events where they also can be helping to give people other kinds of services and information that they may need. We also, of course, saw a lot of people attending rallies for Black Lives Matter after George Floyd's murder, attending to register voters and to try to help get out the vote. That obviously was a huge piece. And yeah, they're great. And the When We All Vote organizing team does a great job in keeping them connected. And I even saw the other day, one of our volunteer groups held like a virtual karaoke night to do virtual karaoke together and also register voters. So yeah, they're just really creative, and obviously we couldn't do the work without them.
Thank you. And I will turn it over to Jamar.
Yeah, sure. Everything Danny and Shannon shared, completely agree. How do we make these interactions engaging as well? And love the creativity that Shannon was talking about. And one of the things I want to hopefully challenge all of us that are here and listening is that every volunteer activity doesn't have to have an action to it. Sometimes we have to be intentional about making space to just build community. So, obviously pre-COVID, folks could do like a potluck or a movie night or something to that effect. And what I've seen is, folks do like bingo or, online trivia, or we did, for example, one of our Democratic clubs did like a movie night where they got on Zoom and then, shared their screen and folks were able to comment and just chat with each other. Because I think that's where, to your question, Michelle, about the burnout happens, right? It's come to this phone bank, come to this voter registration drive, right? We do this every week, it feels like. Come to this hearing, testify here, show up on the floor, and those are important, and I don't want to take away from those. But there's sometimes, especially in these off cycles, where we have to be intentional about taking the time just to build community and just to be there for one another and with one another and have fun. Because that relationship building and that community building is what's going to get us through those hard times. When it is election season, when it is legislative session, and everything seems to just be in chaos. And so I also challenge folks to be thinking about what kind of just things that you can just do just to get to know people And sometimes because this work moves so fast, we don't even get to know each other. What do you care about? What's going on with you, right? What's going on with me? And so in addition to everything Danny and Shannon said about, making your events engaging, being able to provide resources for folks, sometimes making a space for community is a resource for some people, because even outside of the work that we're doing, you don't know what people are dealing with. Right. And especially that all of us have had to deal with this pandemic, and all of us are dealing with it in multiple ways or in different ways. So thinking about how you just build your community and just replenish your community, because you know that some fights are ahead.
Thank you. So I'd love to thank all of you for joining today and close us out with some final thoughts from each of you. Looking to the future. 2022 is in 3 months, and 2024 is 2 years and 3 months after that. So what are some things that you are hoping to see and looking forward to in the digital organizing and grassroots funding space over the next couple of years? And Shannon, I will start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Just a couple of things. I mean, I think, of course, it's just a continuation of everything that I think we've talked about today, trying to find better ways to reach people where they are. And that might mean, again, that you have to go to TikTok versus, the more traditional other social media platforms or things like that. We just have to be really creative and think outside the box. I think another important thing that I know we're thinking about is all the changes in technology that are happening. There's a lot of laws that are changing. There's a lot happening with like Apple software and things like that are really changing the work that we do in the digital space. I mean, or you never know, Facebook and Instagram could go down for a whole day, and your whole day, kind of is thrown into chaos. So I think continuing the work, continuing to build on the base that has already been laid. But I think I know that I personally and in our work are trying to foresee some of those things that are coming down the pike so that we can be prepared to navigate through some of that new landscape.
Thank you. And Danny?
Yeah, Shannon, I think that was very much what I was thinking in terms of being prepared, but also scouting out what's on the foreground words, looking at what's coming at us and trying to figure out how to best leverage new technologies and new platforms to meet young folks specifically where they're at, but also figuring out how to maintain different kinds of relationships with different people with different levels of ownership, different stakeholders, different types of interests in the work that we're doing is a really big piece of the puzzle. And leading into relationships, right? Like, I think, we are an organization that's grounded in transformative justice, and also climate justice as a whole is really, really dependent on relationships and community. So building relationships and community with the folks in our base is really our priority.
Thank you. And Jamar, to end us off.
Oh, sure. And add to that is don't be afraid to try new things. Obviously, COVID forced us to try new things. We're still learning and growing and building as a movement, as Shannon and Danny said, right, be able to look to the future, but also be thinking about who are we looking to the future with, and what systems do we have to navigate to make sure that those folks that we want to reach in our organizations and our campaigns are actually benefited from not just the work, but obviously the work that we have to do to fight within certain systems. I think that those are some very important pieces as well. And remember that, in addition to election results, in addition to results in a legislative body, that engagement is always a win. Whether someone gives a donation, whether someone gets someone else to give a donation, whether they show up to register a voter, whether they show up to call a voter or send postcards or whatever they do as part of this movement, engagement has to be our key, and engagement always has to be a win. So I'm grateful to share this space with all of you, and hopefully you all will stay in touch with us.
Thank you, Danny, Jamar, and Shannon, so much for joining us for this panel, and to all of our guests. I hope you learned something today, and we'll take that into the future of digital innovation. Thank you all so much.